Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
My parents had a way of disguising cruelty as structure. To anyone outside our front porch with its polished steps and immaculately trimmed boxwoods, the Greens were a family of modest success, good taste, and rigid discipline. We did things by the book, my father's book to be specific, where hard work was expected, emotion was excessive, and gratitude was earned like a paycheck. So when my parents called a family meeting 3 days before their trip, I already knew something was off. They only gathered us when there was bad news to deliver, dressed in smiles that didn't touch their eyes, as if that made the blow easier to absorb. We sat in the kitchen, the one with the cold marble island we weren't allowed to lean on, and I watched my brothers grin like jackals. Matthew, 26, corporate ladder climber with a firm handshake and a hollow laugh, and Caleb, 22, community college dropout turned crypto bro. Both had that same smirk that made you feel like the joke was about you and you didn't know it yet. My father stood by the coffee pot, gripping his travel mug like a shield, while my mother leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, her expression soft but purposeful, the way she always looked right before telling me I'd disappointed her. Then came the sentence, the one that was supposed to be cloaked in reason, but came out like a knife wrapped in silk. "This trip," my dad began, "is just for those who deserve a break." My mom nodded in sync, like a backup singer to a lead vocalist. "You've been drifting lately, Marissa," she added. "We thought it might be good for you to stay back. Focus, reflect." They said it kindly, they always did. That was their specialty. Hiding discipline behind concern, punishment behind parental wisdom. I smiled. I really did. I smiled the way you do when you've been hit so many times with a soft insult that you don't even flinch anymore. I nodded and thanked them for being so thoughtful. I helped them pack, even ironed a couple of my father's shirts. I hugged my brothers goodbye, told them to enjoy the Caribbean and to send photos. Caleb laughed and said, "Don't burn the house down, sis." I said, no promises. What they didn't know was that the moment the Uber pulled away, I walked back inside, locked the door, and started packing my own bag. Not out of spite or recklessness, but because something had clicked into place that morning. Like a key finally turning after years of being jammed in the wrong lock. I didn't want their pity, their fake kindness, or their crumbs of approval anymore. I wanted out. I wanted air. I wanted to see what it felt like to live without that constant judgment breathing down my neck like an old, cheap cologne. I went upstairs to my room, the one they never bothered to redecorate after I turned 18, and opened my bottom drawer. I pulled out a small box I hadn't touched in 3 years. Inside was a collection of bills I'd been quietly saving for my part-time jobs. Tutoring, dog-sitting, summer cashier work at the local bookstore. Not much, but enough. Enough for a bus ticket. Enough for a start. And in the bottom of the box, folded twice over, was an address I'd written down the last time I saw her. My Aunt Lila. Lila was the family ghost. My mother's younger sister, the one who ran off when she was 20 to marry a jazz musician and open an antique bookstore. In Detroit. She didn't send Christmas cards. She didn't attend funerals. She existed in whispered warnings, "Don't be like Lila," and passive-aggressive tales about wasted potential and poor decisions. I adored her. She was the only adult who ever told me the truth. The last time I saw her was at my high school graduation 5 years ago. She brought me a leather-bound journal and whispered in my ear, "Write your own story, baby. Don't let them draft it for you." I grabbed my phone and typed a single word into a message. "Coming." The reply came almost instantly. Finally. No address, no explanation. She knew what I meant, and that was enough. That night, I took the midnight bus out of Hartford. I wore sunglasses even though it was dark and stuffed my coat with peanut butter crackers and one of those tiny notebooks I used to fill with quotes I copied out of library books. I sat in the back near the bathroom, where the smell made it impossible to sleep. I didn't care. I stared out the window as the trees blurred past, thinking about every meal I had eaten in silence while my brothers were praised. Every time my mother sighed when I walked into the room like I was a problem she couldn't return. Every Sunday dinner where I was asked about my goals while Caleb got a second helping of roast beef just for showing up. And I realized I didn't feel sad. I felt clean, like someone had taken a sponge to the back of my neck and scrubbed away the grime of expectation. Now here's the thing I want to ask you, because maybe this hits close to home. Have you ever been told you didn't deserve something, not because you failed, but because you didn't perform your pain well enough? Have you ever been the invisible one, not because you weren't there, but because you didn't make enough noise to be seen? By the time the sun rose and we rolled into Detroit, my bones were buzzing with something I hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not yet, but maybe something close. Anticipation, fear, power. I stepped off the bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a phone at 6%, and I saw her waiting near the station doors in a leopard print coat, holding a sign that said, "About damn time." I walked toward her, smiling for real this time, and said the first honest sentence I'd said in years. Let's ruin something. Detroit wasn't beautiful in the way my parents would define beauty. It didn't shine with curated landscapes or glimmering boutiques, and it didn't reek of new wealth and control. Instead, it pulsed. It had a rawness, a kind of honest ugliness that didn't hide its scars or apologize for the graffiti on the train underpass. It smelled like steel and oil and burnt coffee. The skyline was jagged and uneven, littered with half-forgotten warehouses and street murals that shouted louder than billboards ever could. I felt more at home in those first 10 minutes than I had in years under the muted grays and whites of our pristine Connecticut life, where nothing was allowed to be out of place, not even me. Lila's house sat like a secret at the end of a crooked street, nestled between a boarded-up convenience store and an apartment complex that had seen better decades. The paint on her porch peeled in curls, and the garden out front was more weeds than flowers, but it breathed. God, it breathed. There were wind chimes that didn't match, pots with dead herbs next to one still fighting for life, and a screen door that creaked like it was telling its own story every time it opened. She didn't greet me with hugs or tears or big declarations. She just held open the door and said, "Shoes off at the entrance, carpet's older than both of us." And that was that. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon, dust, and the faint musk of old records. The walls were covered in photographs, black and white, color, faded Polaroids, newspaper clippings, and one large frame above the couch that held a wedding photo I had never seen before. Lila in a black dress, not white, standing barefoot beside a man with shoulder-length dreadlocks and a trumpet in one hand. She caught me staring and said, "He left me for a woman in Chicago who said jazz was dying. I hope she's tone deaf." The first night, we didn't talk much about the past, or the reason I showed up. We ate leftover lasagna and drank boxed red wine while the old fan hummed in the corner like a lullaby. Lila told me about her bookstore, closed since the pandemic but still housing more stories than she could ever read in one lifetime. I told her I had no plan, just a need to be anywhere but there. She didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. She just listened with a kind of attention that made you feel like silence wasn't something to be filled, but something to be respected. It was on the second night, after a long day of sorting dusty paperbacks and pretending I knew how to reorganize genres, that she brought out the box. We were sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by stacks of books that leaned like lazy towers, when she stood up suddenly and disappeared into her bedroom without a word. She returned holding a weathered cardboard shoebox, the kind that once held size 7 flats but now looked bloated with secrets. She placed it between us like she was offering a deal, not a gift. I didn't ask. I just waited. When she opened the lid, I expected old love letters or maybe embarrassing photos from her rebel days, but what she pulled out stopped my breath. It was a bundle of envelopes, dozens of them, some still sealed, others torn at the edges. My name was on every single one. I picked one up. The handwriting was mine, looped and nervous from years ago. I remembered this one. I'd written it when I was 17, after my parents banned me from seeing a boy they decided wasn't a serious match. I poured my confusion and rage into that letter, mailed it to Lila, hoping she'd give me the validation my mother withheld. Like it was currency. She never responded. None of them ever came back. I assumed she just didn't care. "I never saw them," she said quietly, her voice scratchy like she'd been screaming in her sleep. "Your mother told me you stopped writing, said you chose their path over mine." She never let them reach me, Marissa. Not one damn letter. I just sat there, holding a piece of my past like it had just been pulled from a grave. Each envelope felt heavier now, not with weight, but with truth. Truth that had been stolen from me under the guise of protection or punishment, or whatever noble lie my parents used to justify, shutting out the only person who ever told me I didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. "She lied to both of us," I said, the words dry in my mouth. Lila nodded, lighting a cigarette with the kind of grace only bitter women can master. "She was always scared of how much you were like me. She saw it early, thought she could train it out of you, but wild doesn't get trained. It waits." I didn't cry, not yet. I folded the letters back into the box, closed the lid, and slid it under the couch like it was too sacred to hold for long. We didn't talk much after that. We sat in the quiet, letting the decades breathe between us. I felt something shifting inside, like the first crack in a frozen lake. Not loud, not violent, but irreversible. That night, I lay awake on the pull-out sofa, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks like constellations. And I realized, for the first time in my life, I was not homesick. I missed nothing. Not the dinners, the long silences at breakfast, the way my mother made compliments sound like warnings. Nothing. And yet there was one thing that started clawing at my mind like a splinter. If they could lie about this, about something so simple, so personal, so deeply mine, what else had they twisted? What else had they stolen, hidden, erased? I turned onto my side, pulled the blanket to my chin, and let a single thought settle where fear used to live. Maybe I hadn't come to Detroit to escape. Maybe I came here to find the truth, and maybe the truth was going to burn. It's a strange kind of ache when you start to understand that the people who raised you, the ones who claimed to know you better than anyone, might have only ever loved the version of you that fit their mold, small, compliant, and easily managed like a polite accessory in the curated catalog of their perfect suburban life. That realization doesn't slam into you like a dramatic car crash. It seeps in quietly, like water under a door, until one day your entire floor is soaked and you can't remember when it started. It was 2 weeks into my stay with Lila when that seepage turned into a flood I couldn't ignore. Detroit had begun to feel less like a layover and more like a reckoning. I found myself walking the city without purpose, watching the way strangers laughed too loud in diners, how neighbors waved with greasy hands from engine hoods, and how no one seemed to be auditioning for approval. That kind of freedom is intoxicating when you've lived most of your life on a stage you never asked to be on, directed by people who couldn't imagine you existing outside their script. I stopped checking my phone for messages from my parents because none came, and the silence became less of a punishment and more of a clean slate. Lila and I developed a rhythm, unspoken, unplanned, but steady. In the mornings, I helped her sort through her impossibly cluttered bookstore, organizing everything from dusty biographies of forgotten senators to erotic vampire thrillers tucked between self-help guides from the 90s. We didn't talk much during those hours, both of us absorbed in the simple labor of arranging chaos, but every now and then she'd glance over and say something like, "Your mom used to love books until they made her feel small," or, "You've got her jaw, but thank God not her silence." It wasn't bitter, just factual, like she was stitching together a version of the woman I thought I knew, one that had edges and corners I'd never seen before. It was during one of those mornings, while reorganizing a stack of old newspapers in the back of the shop, that I got curious. Not curious like a child asking why the sky is blue, but the kind of curiosity that's been fermenting inside you for years. Quiet, patient, deadly. Lila had mentioned once, offhandedly, that my father still used the same password for everything because he thought real security was a myth. I laughed at the time, but now it sat in my brain like a key itching to be turned. I borrowed Lila's old laptop, one of those ancient things that wheezes when you open too many tabs, and logged into my father's cloud storage account. Birthday plus wedding anniversary. The password still worked. The fact that it did almost offended me. Like a man so confident no one would ever question him, didn't even bother to lock the vault. What I found inside wasn't dramatic at first. Financial reports, property tax files, copies of college applications for my brothers. But then I saw a folder labeled estate planning. That's when the cold started spreading through my chest, slow and inevitable. Inside that folder was a document titled Trust Allocations. I clicked it, telling myself I probably wouldn't understand it anyway, that it'd be filled with legalese and hypothetical figures. But it was clear as daylight. A family trust had been established when I was 12. The fund was modest at the time, just under $20,000, but it grew steadily, year by year, into a sizable sum. It was originally intended for 3 beneficiaries, divided equally. My name had been there in the first 3 years of statements, and then, without any explanation, it vanished. The remaining balance, close to $120,000, was listed now under Matthew Green and Caleb Green. My father had marked the document with a note. Marissa's portion reabsorbed into general fund, per discussion with Helen, no objection. I stared at that sentence until the screen blurred. No objection. As if I'd been given a chance to protest. As if the decision had been made in a courtroom instead of behind my back, while I was still being told to just focus on school and not worry about money. I didn't cry, I didn't throw the laptop or scream into the void, like some dramatic movie heroine. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the weight of that betrayal settle over me like dust on forgotten furniture. It wasn't about the money, not entirely. It was about what it meant. That my parents hadn't just failed to see me, they'd actively erased me from their future. They'd planned for a life that didn't include me and thought I'd never be sharp enough to find out. When Lila came back into the room and saw my face, she didn't ask what I found. She just handed me a cigarette and said, "I hope you took screenshots." I did, every single page, every line, every date. I saved them in 3 separate folders, uploaded them to multiple email drafts, and backed them up on a flash drive I tucked into the bottom of my sock drawer. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with them yet, but one thing was clear. There would be no confrontation, no phone calls, no desperate messages asking why. This wasn't about getting answers anymore. This was about taking control of the story they thought they could write without me. Later that night, as I sat on Lila's porch with the documents burned into my brain, and the city humming softly in the distance, I began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Not rage, but a cold, delicious clarity. If they could hide this from me, if they could smile into my face while signing me out of their lives with a few keystrokes and legal jargon, then I had every right to write myself back in. Not as the obedient daughter, not as the background character in their success story, but as the twist no one saw coming. The storm they thought would never form. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and pictured the look on my father's face when he'd eventually realized the locks had turned. The vault had been cracked, and the daughter he thought would always play nice had stopped playing altogether. And in that quiet, strange stillness, I finally smiled. Not with kindness, not with grief, but with intent. There's a certain type of revenge that doesn't wear armor or march in with swords drawn, doesn't need a raised voice or a dramatic exit, because its weapon is truth, cold, unadorned, surgical truth. And when you've been kept quiet long enough, when your own voice has been buried under years of curated silence and soft manipulation, there comes a point where speaking it aloud, clearly and publicly, becomes the most violent act you're capable of. That point came to me not with a scream, but with a blank document on Lila's old laptop, the blinking cursor daring me to say what had never been said. Not to beg for justice or even understanding, but simply to burn the carefully constructed illusion my parents had spent decades pretending was reality. It didn't come easily. Writing that letter, if it can even be called that, felt less like confession and more like surgery without anesthesia. The words weren't gentle or poetic. They were raw and inconvenient, shaped by years of unsaid things that had calcified somewhere between my ribs and now demanded release. Not because I wanted closure, but because I deserved the sound of my own truth echoing through the same channels they had always used to paint me as the underachiever, the too sensitive one, the daughter who was somehow never quite enough no matter how little she asked or how quietly she disappeared. I started with a memory, not one of those warm, nostalgic ones parents like to display in picture frames, but one that stuck with me like a splinter. I was 11 and I had gotten 3rd place in the regional spelling bee. I came home, certificate in hand, cheeks still pink from the thrill of standing on stage. My mother looked at it for a beat, then said, "Maybe next time, go for first." And my father didn't look up from his newspaper. That was the moment I understood how love in our house was conditional, and conditions were never made clear, only implied through sighs, comparisons, and thin-lipped nods. From there, the letter unraveled itself like a thread finally free from the knot. I recounted the times I was punished not for what I did, but for how I made them look. I wrote about the therapy sessions they refused to pay for, the college essays they refused to read, the job offers they mocked because they didn't fit into their narrow definition of worthy careers. I wrote about the dinners where silence was the currency of peace, where one wrong word from me meant a week of cold shoulders and polite disappointment. And I wrote about the trust fund. Yes, I included it, word for word, screenshot by screenshot, because facts, not feelings, were the language they respected. But it wasn't just a list of grievances or an emotional purge meant to shame them into regret. I was smarter than that. It was structured, deliberate, almost surgical in tone. I made sure every accusation came with proof, every emotional cut backed up with something tangible, because I knew they would try to dismiss it all as bitterness, as drama, as some emotional outburst from the daughter who never quite fit in. I gave them no room to maneuver, no cracks to escape through, and then, in a move that felt more terrifying than anything I'd ever done, I posted it, not as a message, not as an email, not even as a private share with a select few. I posted it publicly, as an open letter on Facebook, tagging no one, but leaving the privacy setting on public. I knew that their friends, the ones from church groups and golf clubs, the ones they bragged to about their perfect family, would see it. I knew that my cousins, aunts, old teachers, neighbors, and eventually even their colleagues would see it. But more than any of that, I knew they would see it, and that they wouldn't be able to pretend they hadn't. The final line wasn't poetic or explosive. It was quiet, cruel, and exact. I was never your mistake, but you were definitely mine. I hit post and closed the laptop without rereading it, without overthinking the consequences or bracing for fallout. It was done, not out of anger, but necessity, like pulling a fire alarm in a burning building. You don't apologize for doing what needs to be done when you've been choking on smoke for too long. The first hour was quiet. No reactions, no comments, just the digital equivalent of holding your breath. Then the likes started trickling in, mostly from old classmates, a few distant cousins, one former teacher who messaged me privately to say, "I always wondered why you were so quiet." Then came the shares, and with them, the messages, dozens of them, from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all saying variations of the same thing. I had no idea. This is brave. I went through the same. And then as the sun began to fall behind the broken skyline of Detroit, the silence shattered. My phone rang 16 times in the span of an hour. All from my mother. She didn't leave voicemails, just kept calling, as if the act itself could undo the words now floating freely across the internet. Then came the text, one line only, brittle and enraged. "What did you do?" I didn't respond. I watched the screen flicker in my palm, and set the phone face down on the porch table. Lila came outside, handed me a cup of lukewarm wine, and said nothing. She didn't need to. For the first time in my life, I felt like the storm, and the house I was about to tear down, it wasn't mine anymore. There's a peculiar stillness that arrives after destruction, a kind of eerie calm, not unlike the quiet that follows a winter storm when everything is buried in snow, motionless and untouched. And for a moment it seems the world has stopped breathing just to listen to what comes next. That was the air I inhaled the morning after the letter had circulated like wildfire, spreading across screens, inboxes, and group chats like an uninvited ghost, dragging chains of history through every corner of their carefully managed world. I woke up not to panic or regret or even fear, but to a strange, hollow lightness in my chest, the sensation of finally having exhaled after holding my breath for 28 years. The phone had stopped ringing sometime around 3 in the morning. My mother's final message, short and venomous, "You've humiliated us," sat unopened in my notifications like a failed threat. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't deny anything. She didn't apologize. All she saw was what had cracked, not what had festered underneath for decades. My father, predictably, said nothing. His silence was always louder than her rage, a judgment that didn't need words to cut. The same silence he used to shame, to control, to remind me that he only ever spoke when it mattered. And apparently even now, I didn't. I stayed another day at Lila's, though we both knew I wouldn't for long. Her presence, solid and unshaken, had become an anchor in waters I hadn't realized I was drowning in. She didn't offer comfort the way people usually think of it. No soft reassurances or warm platitudes, but instead gave me her brutal honesty, and more importantly, her respect. She saw me not as a victim or a child lost in rebellion, but as a woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to exist. "Now you know," she said, while slicing an orange with the same precision she'd used to dissect my illusions. "You don't need to be angry forever, but you sure as hell don't need to go back." Still, I needed to return, if only for closure, if only to witness with my own eyes what they looked like when the mirror cracked. So I booked a one-way ticket back to Connecticut, not out of guilt or doubt, but because I had left without saying goodbye to the version of myself that had lived in that house for too damn long. I didn't tell them I was coming. I wanted them unprepared. I wanted the silence to greet me before they had time to rearrange their faces. When I walked through the front door, key still working because they hadn't changed the locks, perhaps because they still hadn't accepted that I was no longer part of the set design, I was struck not by familiarity, but by how foreign everything felt. The house was exactly as I remembered it. The scent of lavender polish clinging to the hardwood floors, the staircase that creaked on the 4th step, the framed certificates lining the hallway like trophies in a shrine. But it was hollow now, stripped of the illusion that used to hold it together like the cheap glue behind wallpaper. No one was home, or if they were hiding, something I wouldn't have put past them. I climbed the stairs slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to savor this final confrontation. Not with them, but with the version of me that had once believed that love was a reward you had to earn by being small, obedient, and invisible. My bedroom door was open. The room was untouched, though emptier than I remembered. Not physically, but emotionally, like all the weight it had once held had been vacuumed out in my absence. I hadn't left much behind, just a few books, a sweater in the closet, and a shoebox of things I hadn't had the heart to bring to Detroit. I packed it all without sentiment, moving with the efficiency of someone who wasn't mourning, just cleaning. The only thing I left behind, deliberately and without ceremony, was a single framed photo, the one from our family vacation to Disney World 10 years ago, the trip they still bragged about to anyone who would listen. I removed it from the bookshelf, took a pair of scissors from the desk drawer, and carefully cut myself out of it, not in rage, but with the precision of someone finally editing the narrative to reflect the truth. I left the cropped photo face up on my perfectly made bed. As I walked back down the stairs, the front door opened. It was my mother, She stood in the threshold, hair pulled too tight, wearing the same strained smile she used at PTA meetings and neighborhood potlucks. But there was something else in her eyes now. Panic, betrayal, maybe even a flicker of doubt. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, not in anger, but in quiet finality. "There's nothing to fix," I said, voice steady, tone even. "There never was, you just didn't want me to be real." She flinched slightly, like the truth had made physical contact. "You should go," she said, but her voice cracked, the first time I'd ever heard it do so. "I already did," I replied, and walked past her into the heavy summer air, the front door closing behind me like the last period on a story that had taken far too long to finish. I took the long way back to the train station, walking through neighborhoods that felt more like memories than places, passing the bakery that used to serve those cookies my father said were too sweet, the park where I once got caught sneaking a book instead of playing with the other kids, the church where I memorized hymns but never believed a word. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt free. And freedom, as it turns out, doesn't always come wrapped in celebration. Sometimes it just walks beside you quietly, making space where there used to be shame. By the time I returned to Detroit, the house felt warmer, more alive. Lila was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and no questions. She handed me a note. Just a sticky pad with a phone number scribbled in my younger brother's handwriting. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," it read. "I didn't call. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Because sometimes silence is not the absence of love, but the loudest form of truth. And maybe, just maybe, this story didn't need a neat ending or a dramatic reconciliation. Maybe some stories are meant to echo, not resolve. Maybe the point was never understood. Maybe the point was to stop explaining.